quilty friend, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and today we're going to take all these blocks behind me and put them together to make a full quilt. This is the last video of the 2024 9-patch block of the month. Some of y'all have been following along, and even if you haven't, we are going to talk about tips and tricks for putting quilts together, blocks like this, block of the month. So if you've ever done a block of the month, or are interested in doing a block of the month, then you may want to watch this video as well to get those tips. All right, friends, you ready? Let's get started. So I have all my blocks here. I've rearranged them a little bit so that we can try to see them all at the same time, and I have my pieces cut. These blocks are coming together with sashing. Sashing is the fabric that goes between the blocks, so kind of like the grout on the tiles. Then we also have our border one. Border one often matches sashing. It's usually the same color, and it just is the first line around the edge. And then we have our border two, which is our focal print fabric. So when we look at this, now this is where I pulled all of my colors for my blocks from this focal print. And it's also where I pulled the color for our sashing and border one. So I have this already cut the way it says in the instructions, and I have for my sashing pieces, actually my border one pieces, I sewed pieces together and then cut those to the length that I needed. You're actually cutting your border one and sashing at the same time, because when we cut pieces, we want to cut our longest pieces first and then our smaller pieces, because sometimes, depending on the size of your quilt, like if you need to sew two pieces together, that's now an 80-inch long strip. And if you need a 60-inch cut of that for a sashing or a border one piece, you still have 20 inches left. And that could potentially be one of your small sashing strips that goes between. You can also sew everything into one big line. Start by cutting your bigger pieces and then cutting your smaller pieces, and if you do that, you can actually get away with only having a yard, just barely. A yard is just barely enough to be able to do your sashing and border one on this quilt. Okay, so I'm going to set the pieces that I don't need aside. So I'm just keeping those small sashing strips. Before we go putting our sashing strips in between our blocks, we may need to square them up. In a perfect world, your blocks are all exactly 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches right now. We don't live in a perfect world, so it's likely that some of your blocks are a little smaller, some are a little bigger, so we need them all to be as close to the same size as possible. I have a whole video where I go through all different kinds of tips and tricks for fixing blocks, squaring up good blocks and then fixing blocks that maybe are outliers. Because if you have 12 blocks and 11 of them measure exactly 12.5, and one of them is measuring at 12 inches, so it's a 1/2 inch too small, you don't want to chop a 1/2 inch off of all of your good blocks just to make them all the same size. Because if you chop a 1/2 inch off of all of your good blocks, right? My mind's boggled there. You're now turning those good blocks, basically you'd be chopping off all your pretty points on all your pieces, and that's such a sad waste. So go to that video, I'll link it here and as well in the description so that you can watch that video if you need to square up any of your blocks. Mine are pretty good. They're all within like 1/8 of an inch or so. So we're going to just let it ride, and we're going to take these sashing strips and put them between the blocks. So these are going to go not on these outsides, so just 2 per row to put our rows together. So it's going to be block and then sashing strip, a block and then sashing strip, a block. And we can do that for all 4 rows, and that puts our rows together. So let's go ahead and grab our first one. And I love having a big design wall like this. This is the first time I've had a nice big design wall like this in over 30 years of quilting. So if you don't have a nice big design wall like this, that's okay. The floor makes an amazing design wall. And if you have a floor that is like the living room floor and you have kids and pets that are going to be walking all over your design floor, lay them all out on the floor, take a picture, and then pick them up. and that way you know what is supposed to go where, and you can keep track of it on your photo. You can even print out that photo and draw on it if you need. But that is what I did for years before I was able to get a nice big design wall in my space. Okay, so we're gonna flip this over and we're gonna sew our sashing strips on. We have our 1/4 inch foot on our machine, and now we're just gonna sew. Now you can choose to sew them all on and then press, or you can sew one, press one. It's up to you. I'm putting them right back up on the design wall, so for me it makes sense to sew one, press it, put it up, sew one, press it, put it up. But I'm just going to add a sashing strip to the right side of these 8 blocks, and we're going to ignore these other 8, or these other 4, just for a little bit. So we have all of our small sashing pieces sewn to one side of each block, and we just need to sew these now into rows. So these 2 will come together, be sewn, and then we'll sew the next piece right on the end. So that will make 4 rows of 3. So we don't need to press yet, but we do want to just pick this up, make sure we are putting the correct sides together. Now that we have these stitched together, now we can press, and we're going to press towards the sashing. Even if you've been pressing open, I do like pressing towards the sashing when we do sashings, because there are generally no seams in the sashing. Sometimes you have one if you piece together your strips to make your sashing, but generally there's not a lot of piecing in the sashing, and even if there is, it's straight piecing. There's not a lot of bulk. So we're pushing all of that bulk into the sashing. There we go. That's our first row. We're just going to repeat that process for 3 more rows, and then we'll come back to put our long sashing pieces in. We have all our rows together. They're looking great. Now we need to put our long sashing strips, and we have 5 of these. You'll notice we have 1, 2, 3 in between spots. But we're actually going to put our sashing and our border 1 on at the same time. So we're also going to have 1 on the top and 1 on the bottom when we finish sewing these 5 on. So we can put 1 on the bottom of each one of these rows, but then we're also going to want to put 1 at the top of the top row. So the top row will be sandwiched between 2 green strips, and then each of the other rows will just get 1 underneath. So we'll go ahead and sew those on. I like starting by doing the bottom on all the rows and then adding that extra strip, just in case I make a mistake somewhere. I don't know, it's just my preference. Oh! And then I want to make sure that I'm sewing that to the bottom. There we go. I like having, now because this is a longer strip, it's super easy for it to get like out of whack. And what I mean by that is the blocks and the strip can stretch at a different rate from one another, and that's not a good thing. So we are pinning the beginning and the end, and then I have a middle crease on all of my strips. So that middle crease is going to go in the middle of this block. It's really nice if this block has a middle seam. This one doesn't, but that's the middle right there. And then at least 1 more pin along here, just to kind of ease it in. Sometimes there is a little bit of difference between the length of your strip and the length of your row, and so we want to ease that. And then if there's a lot of difference between your strip and your row, then you need to look at having different size strips. So these strips have all been measured and cut. based on having blocks that were 12.5 inches when we squared them up. If yours were not 12.5 inches when they were squared up, you'll have to do a little quilt math if your blocks aren't exactly at 12.5 inches. But it'll get you a smoother, flatter quilt in the end. So now that we've pinned these, we're just gonna sew these on. And now that I have that sewn on, I'm just going to go ahead and press. You can wait until all of these rows have been sewn together to press this, but I like to press them now because it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot to press. So I can not press, and then I'll take it to my big ironing board to press all the seams then at the end. But for this one, I'll just press as I go. There's no right way here though. As long as you're not stitching over a seam yet, you don't have to press it yet. All right, there we go. We're just gonna go ahead and add a sashing strip like this to the other rows, and then one up at the top for our first border. And then we'll come back and talk about how to line these up so that these sashing strips look like they would just extend right on down. Now that all our rows have a sashing strip on them, we need to put them together, and we want to put them together in a way that this sashing strip looks like it is straight. So we don't want crooked tiles on here if we can help it. Now there is a trick to that. I'm going to show you. So we're going to take this piece that we're going to connect to this piece right here, and we're going to put it on the table. I don't have a mat on here, that's okay. You really just need your ruler and some kind of marking pen. We're going to line this up, and we're lining up the edge here, and then we're making a mark. We have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on our quilt, so this mark is just going to be in the seam allowance. You can do it with a mechanical pencil, you can do it with a fabric marking pen, but we just want to have marks here and here, because that is basically telling us where, if this line were extended, where it would get extended to. And I like lining up this seam on a ruler line as well as the edge, just because if I have a square angle like that, I feel like I'm more likely to have a straight line. There, oh, without a mat on here, it gets slippery. Okay. And that can just go in that 1/4 inch. So we have our row. We're going to take the next row, which is going to go right on top of there. And when we pin this time, instead of pinning the ends and the middle, we'll still want to pin those ends, but we will pin so that these center seams, these seams on our sashing, line up with those lines that we made. And we're just going to give it a pin on both sides. On both of these. So now you can pin the beginning and end, or you can just hand match them up, which is probably what I'm going to do here, and sew these two together. I'm going to sew the top two together, then I'm going to sew the bottom two together, and then I'm going to sew down the middle. You could do the top, the second, the third, and then the fourth, and then keep adding on, but then you're just making it heavier and heavier and heavier as you go. This is going to get heavier, and then we're going to go same weight, and then our heaviest seam at the end. But that will be a little less trying to maneuver everything through the machine all at once. Okay, so I'm going to get all these rows together. It's starting to look like a full quilt, and then we're going to talk about putting on our long border one strips. Our rows are all together, and we have the top and bottom of our border one on because those were put on the same time as our long sashing strips. Now we have our long border one strips, and those are going to go on either side. We're going to put these on the same way that we put these pieces on. So when we sew this to the bottom, we don't have to worry about making those lines because there's nothing to line up here. We're going to pin on each side, in the middle, and then 2 places in between so that we have any ease that we need. If your blocks weren't exactly 12.5 inches, then you're going to have to figure out how long you need your strips. The easiest way to do this is to measure one side, measure the middle, and measure the other side. You're going to add those numbers together and divide by 3 because you took 3 measurements, and that's going to give you the average height of your quilt. That's what size you're going to cut both of your strips, so what length you're going to cut both of your strips, and then you can pin them and sew them on, and it'll help make your quilt more square. So even if this side is off from the other side by like 1/2 inch, that will help with the ease and make your quilt more square when we finish. So we're gonna just sew these on, easy peasy. Oh, it's a whole quilt. And after this, we're gonna put on our border 2, and then our quilt will be done. One thing to note is that if you have any seams, which we do here, here's my seam, you want to make sure that your seam is the wrong side of your fabric. So when you put this right sides together, that your seam is out and we're not stitching it so that our seam is facing forward, because having to unpick this whole seam is such a bummer. Another tip would be go ahead and replace your bobbin right now. Put a fresh bobbin in if you haven't in a while, because this is a super bummer seam to stitch the whole thing and then realize that on inch 2 you ran out of bobbin. That's the worst. So go ahead and give yourself a fresh bobbin, and that way you don't have to worry about running out of bobbin just a couple inches in. And then you can always use that partially full bobbin on something else later, or you might go to change out that bobbin and say, I was about to run out. Oh, good choice. Okay, because I don't necessarily know exactly where the middle on this is, it's pretty easy to take my quilt, fold it in half, find that middle like this, and then pin that middle. There we go. And now we're going to pin these long sides. For this, I'm going to go ahead and pin both sides and get both of these pinned on, and then I can just sew, 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 and sew everything all at once. Okay, we have our side borders on. This quilt is getting bigger. I brought the quilt down a bit so we can talk about top border. So top and bottom borders are next. They're going to go on the exact same way as the other borders have gone on. Pin each end, find the middle, pin the middle, add a pin in between, and sew those top and borders on. Then press towards the border and do the exact same thing on the 2 outsides, and that's it. You're going to have a finished quilt. So we're going to go ahead and work on that, and when we come back, we're going to have all our outside borders on. Outside borders, border 2, those are interchangeable because we don't have a border 3. We could add a border 3, border 4. If you want to make this quilt bigger, just keep adding borders. This is a 3-inch finished border. The next border is a 6-inch finished border. If you were to add another border after that, I would probably do an even bigger border, like an 8-inch or a 10-inch border. Because you have a 3 and a 6, you could also do a 9-inch border, and that would give you some like mathematical symmetry because the first 2 borders equals the same as the outer border. And whatever width you decide on your border, just add a 1/2 inch for your seam allowance. So we're going to go ahead and add these borders and then come back and look at our finished quilt top. All right, the quilt is all put together. We have those final borders on, and that's what brings all this color together. So go ahead and pull this off of the design wall real quick so we can take a closer look at all that fun color. So now what's left is to pick a backing fabric and to quilt this. So you can send it to a long armor. You just need your backing fabric and talk to your long armor about an all over design or some other fun design for your quilt. So you can send it to a long armor, or you can quilt it yourself. You can free motion quilt it, or you can do walking foot quilting. For me, to get this one just done, I'm going to walking foot quilt it. When we're looking at quilting, you definitely want to look at your batting and see how far apart you can have your stitches on your batting. Usually it's somewhere between 6 and 10 inches. Because these are 12-inch blocks, you need to look at, okay, where in the middle of these blocks am I going to stitch? So I could stitch on, like, stitch in the ditch on each row because I did press to the side. So I could do a stitch in the ditch here and here, and then I could do it on each block. I could stitch in the ditch all the way. Be a lot of stitching. It would look good. Another option would be to do some diagonals across. So I could do diagonals along some of these seam lines, but I don't have those seam lines in every single block. So I could also just do like a diagonal X across the block, and that would give me a good 6 inches between from the widest point of quilting, and so that would work to stitch an X like diagonally through the whole, through all the blocks, and then diagonally the other way. That's probably what I'll end up doing on this quilt, and I may even do that on my sashiko. And so my next step is going to be looking at thread colors. Here are some sample thread colors that could all work. So I have this that would look great with this background. It would also look great on top of this green, but I don't know how it would look on top of this pink. I think it would look okay on the orange. I would just be worried about it quilting through the pink. I could do the pink, but I don't know how that pink would look on, no, the pink might not look terrible in the green. I also have a lighter pink. And I have this blue. And this blue is a variegated. These are all 12 weight threads. The quilting is going to stand out a lot with these threads. I'm pretty sure my choice is going to be this pink variegated thread. I'm going to play with it a little more and we'll see how it ends up. But you already know because you've seen this finished quilt at the very beginning of this whole series. So friends, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've had a great time making your quilt. Please send me pictures of your finished quilt. I can't wait to see. You can find me on social media. You can comment down here below. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up. And are you joining in for 2025? Thanks for watching. Thanks so much for watching, my friends. I will see you right here real soon. Bye for now.